Hi, Pelican Briefs listeners. Charles and I are back today with another Pelican Pop-In. While our previous discussions have all touched on Season 1 topics, today we wanted to take the opportunity to bring attention to an exceptional new exhibit currently on display at the historic New Orleans collection. Joining us today to take us inside Captive State, Louisiana, and the Making of Mass Incarceration is HNOC curator and historian Eric Seiferth. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Natasha. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So we're going to kick it off. Charles has a couple questions that he'd like to ask about Captive State.
Good afternoon, Eric. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with y'all.
Yeah, we're a big fan of the historic New Orleans collection. Y'all do some really good work. So
thank you.
Keep doing what you're doing. So let's just jump right into it. This is a great exhibit. Itasha and I definitely want to go see it. So we kind of just start off with a general question of how did the Captive State exhibit come to be? So just a general overview of how y'all got to the topic, what y'all are doing, and so forth.
Yeah, of course. So the topic, Louisiana, the Making of Mass Incarceration, we really look at 300 years of the practice of punishment and incarceration in Louisiana. Louisiana incarcerates more people than just about anywhere else in the world, sadly. Recent data shows about 1,000 per 100,000 people in the state are incarcerated, or 1 in 100, which is well above the average in the United States, which is around 600 people per 100,000. And the United States is well above most other places around the world, and considerably so. It's not a little bit, it's by a few degrees. So we wanted to interrogate that historically and kind of see why that is the case, if we could understand more about the why of mass incarceration in Louisiana. And what we came to was this historical linkage between systems of slavery and systems of mass incarceration. And I'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go along in our conversation. But to stay on to your question, that's what the show's about. That's kind of where we ended up. But where we started was with a series of photographs from photographer Lori Wesselchuk and 2 quilts from artists Stephen Gardner and Gary Tyler that were part of the hospice program at Angola. This artwork, and the photos show the hospice program at Angola. And the artwork came to us in 2016, and we knew right away that it was something that we wanted to present to the public. And that opened up kind of the Pandora's box of, well, how? What do we want to share with this? So over the ensuing years, we've kind of been doing that work. And really about the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working on the project. And around that same time that we got this photo series and these 2 quilts, which are on display in the show, we also put on an exhibition entitled Purchased Lives, which looked at the domestic slave trade in New Orleans and its history. And, one of the things that came out of that is a greater awareness of the city's role in the domestic slave trade. It was the center of the domestic slave trade about 200 years ago, or another way of thinking about that is more people were bought and sold in New Orleans 200 years ago than anywhere else in the country. And this had an outsized effect on American history, on New Orleans history, on Louisiana history. And doing that project and the responses we got from the project really opened our eyes into fleshing out that story further, because we really just hit the tip of the iceberg with it. There are these very clear connections between that history and the one we present in Captive State. So those 2 things kind of happened at the same time and pushed us forward in the direction of making the connection. And we've kind of gone from there. We've had the chance to work, myself, along with the curatorial team, Kevin Harrell and Catherine Dunn, with and the rest of our exhibition team, with some advisors. We had an advisory board for this project that met for about 18 months prior to our opening, and they, helped us push things even further and added practical, experiential, and academic knowledge of the subjects. Together, we all worked, hand in hand to figure out the way to tell the story, to go from, we have these images that are incredibly moving to the full picture, or, broadly speaking, a look from above on this 300-year history, because of course, we are limited. It's a big story.
Very big story.
Yeah.
It's like a big topic here, but you know what? I think you're doing it justice. So
thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely want to hear more about those originating images and the quilt that kind of helped kick this off. But before we get into some of the contemporary components, could you maybe provide a bit of a larger historical context and timeline for Louisiana becoming the nation's incarceration capital and how that links the past with the present today?
Yeah. Louisiana, New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, as we know, is kind of the European founded city, uh, is dates to 1718. There are people here beforehand, and this is part of France's colonizing empire, right? So they bring with them, the French colonizers, an existing system designed to implant and create a white supremacist society coming from Europe. That includes enslaved Africans. It includes diplomatic and military relations with the nations that are existing here already. One of the things that comes of this French colonial settlement is the Code Noir. And this is a set of laws that are directed towards people of African descent and religious minorities, but it's predominantly targeting enslaved people because, of course, this is a colonial white supremacist slave society. And so they are setting up laws from the founding of our city, New Orleans, to create just that, a white supremacist slave society. I think it's important that we start from the beginning, and that's the beginning of that's the foundation of our city. So we start there in our story, and we show how that evolves over the colonial era, where we see in 1751 new laws written that further curtail the rights and movements of enslaved people, and add in language around policing. And there's a provision that says, no enslaved people, no people of color should be carrying any kind of weapon at all on the streets. And if they're found to be doing so, the first white person who comes across them should take that weapon and strike them. So we're reinforcing the system we're trying to create. You see it happen later in the Spanish era, again, where there is some work towards policing, maintaining, and further restricting Black life. And then you get to kind of the meat of our story, which is the 19th century American era. And that's when New Orleans becomes the center of the domestic slave trade in the United States. And that's when New Orleans becomes American. That's where New Orleans grows, and grows very quickly because of the financial implications of its role as the center of the domestic slave market. And as that's happening, we see the growth of a carceral state. This is when the city's first police first police force is officially chartered in 1808, which is the same year that we start our first police jail, which is an extrajudicial detainment center for enslaved people. Enslaved people could be arrested for attempting to escape, for committing some kind of crime. They could be sent there by their enslavers for punishment, or a free person of color could be arrested and sent to a police jail. And all of this happens outside of any judicial process. And once people are in the police jail, the city basically works them on the chain gang. The chain gang is something we know in the United States in popular culture. It's infiltrated the popular culture, and it comes from the Caribbean, and it comes into the United States through New Orleans. And we have what we believe to be the first image of a chain gang in all of the United States that dates to about 1815, wow. Which shows enslaved people wearing chains working for the city. They have been arrested in the police jail. And to accompany this, we have a surveyor's daybook, which lists every single day where in New Orleans and who and how many enslaved people were working on the chain gang. Wow. So the city, it's incredible to kind of see this. What we track here is the forced labor of incarcerated people who are really responsible for, in so many ways, building New Orleans from the Spanish era through today, and that forced labor exists. So this is a big moment in our story where you really see incarceration being used as a tool to maintain, again, this white supremacist slave society, and you see it exploding to meet the demands of an exploding in size slave society. And it really sets the stage for a lot of our carceral policies, like forced labor, like, the chain gang that we saw for so long. It's when we build Orleans Parish Prison, not the one we have today, but the one in Tremay. We build a bigger jail in one of the oldest Black neighborhoods in America. The city, expands into 3 municipalities at this point too, and each one has a jail. So we're really building an infrastructure of incarceration during this era, which I think is an era of mass incarceration.
Right.
There are moments when carceral rates and infrastructure and targeting of specific groups in society for social control ebb and flow. This is one of them prior to the Civil War. After the war, you see this moment of the convict lease, which I can get into more later. We'll see how our conversation goes, but this is essentially when the plantation prison system is devised, and we create a penitentiary plantation-based prison system operating at Angola, which was previously owned by the largest slave trader in the United States. His name's Isaac Franklin. It eventually becomes ownership of an ex-Confederate officer named Samuel James, who purchases the right to custodianship of every person convicted of a felony in the state of Louisiana, which the number grows immensely, and it goes from a relatively small number, mostly white men, to a large number of mostly Black men before and after the war. And most of them are being forced to labor on the plantations at Angola, which the state takes over operations of in the 20th century and is today, where thousands of mostly Black men are incarcerated with sentences where they will die at Angola, and where they continue to be forced to labor, oftentimes in the fields for as little as 2 cents an hour. So there's this unbroken history from this era of the domestic slave trade, specifically at Angola, to today. Yeah, go
And
ahead.
I was going
Powerful
to say, I think
expression what
that's,
you said. Unbroken history.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
I have never really thought of those words. Unbroken history.
I
Yeah,
think that's such a powerful point, because for so many, I think, contemporary Louisianians, right, you say Angola and people recognize it as the state penitentiary, never really appreciating and making that connection. Essentially, as you said, an unbroken chain of incarceration and the use of people in a commodity.
yeah. And you feel it when you're out there. It feels like a plantation, and it was. And I think that that's an important thing for us to remember when we're talking about incarceration and mass incarceration in Louisiana. Is this connection is still strong. One of the things that happens in that era is that the state decides to require only 9 of 12 jurors to concur to convict someone of a felony. That happens in 1880. And that's the same year that Samuel James buys the Angola plantations. And that is designed to silence the voices of Black jurors who are federally required to sit on juries. That law is put into the 1898 state constitution and lasts, with a slight modification in the 20th century where we updated to 10 of 12 jurors, until 2017.
Right.
Right.
At which point the people of Louisiana vote against it. We vote to require unanimous juries in 2017, which I point out because I think it's incredibly important as part of our work in this exhibition, is to talk about the fact that this system of incarceration is our system that we live with as Louisianians, and it's mutable. It is designed for certain reasons. It can be changed. And if we really look at it, at what it is, and pick our heads up and be honest with ourselves, at that point we can decide if and how we would want it to be in the future. So I think it's really moving that it's the people that do that. Now, of course, the next year the federal government says, oh yeah, that's unconstitutional. You actually have to have a unanimous jury to convict someone of a felony in the United States, even for a state crime. But that's 100, and we have it counted in the exhibition. It's 140 years, something like that, 137 years, where people were serving time, sometimes life sentences, for crimes without a unanimous jury conviction. It also increased the number of people who agreed to plea bargains, or to agree to plead guilty, even though they were not, because they had the ability to take a 5-year sentence versus facing a life sentence from a jury they didn't have any faith would see their case out.
What's so fascinating about this is that, in hearing you lay out this timeline and everything's unbroken and connected, is that we kind of sometimes foolishly think that this stuff is stuck in the past, but we're debating this stuff right now. All the current controversy around the district attorney in New Orleans letting people out, right? Disproportionately more than other parishes, and kind of hearing his side versus the other side. And anytime you hear it talk, it all evokes history, right? We can't understand why we are the way we are today without situating it into the larger history of how we got here. I think that's what makes this exhibit so powerful, right? Is that you indisputably provide the linkage unbroken, right?
Yeah.
We just simply replaced one system with another. It basically sounds like an exhibit of Michelle Alexander's book, the New Jim Crow, right? How she creates that timeline, and we just replaced one system with another, with another, with another.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that book I recommend to any of your listeners. It's a great book, and it really did inform us. It's kind of the national story.
Oh, cool.
Of this in so many ways. And we hope that this, our telling is really New Orleans and Louisiana version of that. But it's all connected. And sadly, New Orleans and Louisiana were kind of leaders in some of what happened in the country. Not only the rape, but things like policies like the chain gang, like forced labor, like how incarceration develops around the systems of slavery, the plantation prison systems. A lot of these things are things that are practiced across the country or in lots of different places in the country, or influence different policies across the country that come out of New Orleans and Louisiana. So it is an American story, but we're going to look at it from the lens of what happens here in New Orleans, in Louisiana.
That's awesome. I'm interested in your thoughts on how we kind of bring this to the present. And in Louisiana earlier this year, the governor called his special crime session where the state legislatures convened. And the end result was we rolled back a lot of the bipartisan laws passed in 2018 that were aimed to reduce incarceration rates, to create things more efficient and kind of look at lower level crimes. But then we kind of took it all away years later, right? We play on people's emotions with the pandemic. And so we continue to go into this seemingly never-ending cycle in Louisiana where we incarcerate the most people, but then have very high crime. So something is broken. Something is not working. We continue to do the same thing, expecting different results, but we're not. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that rolling back within the context of this exhibit.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting because when we started this project, it was around 2017 and 2018, and we were working with advisors. And there was this moment where it was very popular to talk about reform of the criminal legal system here in Louisiana, but also across the country. And there was a lot of hope for people that those reforms would enact meaningful change in some way or another. And over the course of the exhibition, that's kind of changed to where, in the beginning of this year, Governor Landry did call the special crime session, which reversed a lot of those laws passed, I don't know, 8 years earlier, 7 years earlier. So it's really interesting. And historically, it mirrors a trend that we see in Louisiana and we see nationally, where there is a kind of ebb and flow of power and what people with power use that power for, and kind of our sense of just social norms and social structures generally, right? So you see these things change over time. So it's not surprising at all to me as a New Orleanian to see that they're kind of on the other side of what we saw in 2017 and 2018 and those years of reform, where there's a new group in power that are saying that didn't make us safer. We're going to do something different. Historically, efforts, kind of what Michelle Alexander would call tough on crime legislation and policies and rhetoric, has generally produced higher rates of incarceration, historically speaking. We see that in New Orleans and Louisiana, especially during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You see politicians like Harry Connick, who's a prosecutor. He was a DA in Louisiana. He uses that rhetoric quite a bit. Laws in New Orleans, Louisiana, and across the country, also part of the war on drugs movement that comes out of the 80s, 70s, and 80s. It resulted in much higher levels of incarceration. So you see, in New Orleans, in Louisiana, and the United States, for example, in about 1960, the incarceration rate is about 80 people per 100,000. Today, in Louisiana, it's 1,000 people for 100,000. In the United States, it's 600 people per 100,000. So it has gone up over 10 times in Louisiana. It has not proven to result in a state that is 10 times safer than it was in 1960. We track that in the exhibition. You can kind of see that rate rise in our section on mass incarceration, and you can see some of the laws passed that Harry Connick Sr. trumpets as making us safer, and the language he uses to get elected. So, yeah, it remains to be seen what happens next in Louisiana. But I can say from, looking at the historical record, and certainly in the exhibition, we do this, that the main thing that happens from the principal kind of result is higher rates of incarceration. I'll leave it there for now.
Right. Exactly.
When we think about your vision around eradicating mass incarceration in Louisiana and in the country more broadly, what are the types of changes you think should be happening, both from the perspective of our political leaders, but also for us as everyday Louisianians? What can we be doing differently?
I hope that our exhibition starts by giving Louisianians, New Orleanians information to make us better informed, and so that we can really look at incarceration and public safety in a way that we have all the information. We know where these policies came from. We can see what the results have been in different efforts over time. And I think that is really the starting point for us as a place having any meaningful change in any direction. We need to I think, to terms in so many ways with what our systems of incarceration are and where they came from. So I hope that we can start that process. One of our goals for the exhibition is that people will come away talking to their networks, their families, their friends about what they saw and the information they gathered. And, we drive by the jail all the time in New Orleans, all the time. We kind of ignore it. So I think that we need to look at it. It's ours. It has a huge role in how our city and state work. In 2024, this year, the state of Louisiana budgeted just shy of $1 billion for Department of Corrections. There's $71 million for Department of Corrections. In New Orleans, there's different ways to count and look at budgets, but by our count, it's about $250 million that we've budgeted for criminal legal services things, to operate the jail, for our policing, on and on. So these are huge outlays of money. These are huge priorities of our government that we've identified for our government to do for us. We need to talk about that and think about it, whether we think we should incarcerate more people or less. Let's have this conversation about this thing that we feel is so important that we're spending $1 billion on it. So I hope we can accomplish some of that too. And then I think as you go through the exhibition, you can see, hopefully you can break down a little bit about how these laws have been written, what they're accomplishing. And I hope we can erode this idea that I think is a simplification that hurts our ability to talk about incarceration, where we see crime and incarceration rates linked, at the hip. And they're just not. And they're not for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that every place has different laws. We write what our laws are, and we also write the punishments for being convicted of breaking a law. And we also have determined how we decide if someone has broken the law or not. So, for example, just that 10-2 provision that was in place for so long resulted in huge numbers of incarceration, higher rates than exist elsewhere, because it's easier to incarcerate and to convict than elsewhere. Another example I'll give is life without parole. So in Louisiana in 1970, if you were convicted and sentenced to a life sentence, you were eligible for parole after a decade. By the end of the decade, by 1980, if you were convicted of a crime and the sentence was life, you were not coming home. You were sentenced to die in prison. And many of the people are there dying now. So this has a huge impact on rates of incarceration across the state. The numbers behind that are, in 1970, we have about 190 people serving life sentences in the state of Louisiana. It's under 200. by 2020, we have about 4,500 people serving life sentences. This is a huge number of people.
If I'm
You know,
mistaken,
like,
I've
so
added more crime categories to life without parole, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it's going to
that's
balloon.
correct.
It's going to.
So, and we did that. We've done that over the last 50 years too. This isn't a new provision, but we have done things like increase crimes where life without parole could be the sentence. And then we've also enacted things like mandatory minimum sentencing. So we've removed discretion from judges. So judges are required to sentence people to longer sentences. So a lot of it is not just there's more crime, so there's more incarceration. We're arresting people for more things, and we're putting them in prison for longer than ever before.
While adding 17 to the equation as well.
Increasing the base of people who could be subject to these laws. And that's something we've done historically too. So all of those things are drivers of us having this high incarceration rate. So there's more to it than just there are so many people in prison because there's so much crime. There are questions of what do we want to happen after somebody commits a crime? What do we want the sentence to be? How long should they be in prison? Should they come home from prison? Should there be additional punishments? Should there not? It's very nuanced, and I hope that some of that comes across so that we can think more about this complexity, and it's not just, well, there's a lot of crime in New Orleans and Louisiana, and of course there is, and nobody wants that. You know, we all want to feel and be safe. I think that's a great starting point, and I hope we can think about public safety in a way that that not only looks at incarceration as the only option, but understands what incarceration is on a bigger scale. It's not just you do a crime, you did some crime and you serve some amount of time. We can make sentences longer or shorter. Right. What do we want to do? How do we want that to be? So I hope as people come through, regardless of where they started, they at least have more nuanced understanding of what that could look like.
This really beautifully connects with kind of how we started our conversation. And you mentioned the photographs and the quilts that came out of the hospice program that sort of helped to start to inspire the thought around this exhibit. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of the hospice program, particularly at Angola State Penitentiary?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming back to that. So Angola is the maximum security prison in the state. There are 8 prisons. In 1960, there was 1. It was Angola. There are 8 now. And the majority of people there are sentenced to die there. And by majority, I think it's upwards of 90%. So that's people with life sentences without parole, people with death sentences, capital, punishment offenses, people with sentences exceeding 51 years. You're not going to live to see the end of your sentence. So it's about 90% of men there, because it's a male prison, are going to die there. So in 1998, as this was really, people are getting older and dying, a hospice program developed to take care and provide palliative care to the people who were dying. And it's provided by hospice volunteers who are men incarcerated at LSP at Angola, who are most likely also going to die there. And, most people there have been there for, especially the older folks, and most people are older now, have been there for decades. So these are people they have spent the better part of their lives with. And they're sitting down and caring for them as they pass away. They are providing funerary rites and burying them in the cemetery there, Point Lookout. The cemetery has filled up. There is now a second cemetery. And so there's this humanity, right? There's this undeniable love and humanity that comes through in this program. And so the photos show the process of this. They show people caring for people as they're passing away. They show a burial. They show pallbearers carrying the casket of someone they knew to bury them in the cemetery. And the quilts are made by hospice volunteers. So they're made by incarcerated people at Angola. and they make them to raise money for hospice. They sell them at the crafts fair in the fall and in the spring, and they also drape them over caskets at burial. So 2 of the quilts that we have were done by these amazing artists, Stephen Garner, who made the Joy of Freedom quilt, and with his team, he was the lead quilter, and Gary Tyler, who made the Tree of Life. And the Joy of Freedom quilt shows a burial, and it shows in Point Lookout in the cemetery, and it shows the breaking of chains around a man's hands like this with a butterfly emerging. And, the imagery is very clear. The only path to freedom for most people at Angola is through death. That is the Joy of Freedom. So they're amazing artworks. We invite the public to on October 23rd in the evening, where Lori Wesselchuk, the photographer who took the photos, Gary Tyler, Stephen Gardner, the quilters, will all be as part of a panel with Norris Henderson, who is the founder of Vote and one of the founders of the hospice program, along with Anthony Hingle Jr., who worked in the medical ward at Angola and was on our advisory board. They're going to be presenting to the public about the hospice program in Angola and the quilts. And you can register and find info on that at our website, hnoc.org. But I highly recommend joining us for that discussion.
I mean, when I was reading about Captive State, that was one of the things that really stood out to me the most, is about the hospice program. And I think you really hit on the most important part of what Captive State, what the exhibit is really trying to get to the root of, which is the humanity, right? These are our people, our fellow people. And I really hope that everyone has the opportunity to go and to see this and to really connect with the human aspect of this.
Yeah, it's a story about people. It's a story about us. I hope that comes through. This is about how we've decided to live together and how that works in Louisiana and how incarceration fits in that puzzle. But that's all about us. It's all about people.
Could you let our listeners know how long Captive State will be on display and where they can go to get more information, or if they'd like to visit?
Absolutely. So the show will be up through January 19th.
Oh, cool.
It is on display at the Historic New Orleans Collection at 520 Royal Street. It is free to visit. We are open every day but Monday. You can just walk in 520 Royal Street, and our team will direct you to the exhibition. If you want to find more info, you can at our website, HNOC.org. There's a page there, if you click on exhibitions, that will outline everything about our project. So yeah, I hope people can come and spend some time in the galleries.
Definitely encourage everyone listening to go and visit. I've been to some exhibits at the HNOC before. They always do a really great job there. And as Eric mentioned, it's free. So that's always exciting. We encourage our listeners to take advantage of that. And Charles, if our listeners would like a little more Pelican Briefs in their life, can you let them know where they can go for that?
Absolutely. So we're tackling some really good issues on Pelican Briefs, right? So for all of our listeners, we're available on all the major streaming services, so you can catch all of our episodes there. Our episodes are pop-ins, so Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, we're in all of it. So subscribe, even our Patreon as well, so if you want more additional special episodes that we do. But continue to follow us on Pelican Briefs. We will bring you all of the things that are happening in our state. We encourage you to go to all of our museums. We have a ton of museums in the city, including the wonderful Historic New Orleans Collection. So go support the work of the important work that our fellow New Orleans are doing.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Pelican Briefs.
If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
If you are loving the show, you can help us keep the conversation going by supporting us on Patreon.
Your contribution on Patreon ensures we can continue producing quality content you love.
Click the link in the description to become a patron today.
Until next time, this is Pelican Briefs.